Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Transport Topics webinar. My name is Sue Hensley, and I'm the publisher of Transport Topics. I'll also be serving as your moderator for today's program. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us. We look forward to providing information and insights today that you can put to use in your own business operations. That's the mission of Transport Topics and what we strive for in this informative webinar series. The title of today's webinar is Top Trucking Regulatory Issues in the New Administration. And our presenters today are Annette Sandberg, the CEO of TransSafe Consulting and a former administrator at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And joining her is Warren Hoemann, the former deputy administrator at the FMCSA and a consultant to PrePass. We'll begin our presentation in just a moment, but first a few housekeeping items. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties with either the audio or video portions of the program, you can call the following number for assistance. 1-800-785-5623. Again, for technical assistance, that number is 1-800-785-5623. And here's a brief overview of our program. You can follow the presentation via the slide deck on screen, and while this is taking place, please feel free to submit questions for our speakers. Click on the ellipse icon next to the chat bottom at the bottom right of your screen. Select Q&A to open that Q&A panel. Type in your question and hit submit. And at the end of our presentation, we will have a Q&A session and do our best to answer all of your questions. Each change in our country's leadership brings a different vision of how our federal government should be run. That vision extends to the rules that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration adopts and enforces. Annette and Warren will tell you what to expect from the new president and FMCSA administration, as well as the new Congress. PrePass Safety Alliance is the leading provider of way station bypass and electronic toll payment services in North America. PrePass offers bypass choices, including transponders and a mobile app. They're also the only bypass provider offering software for improving safety scores and toll-related costs. At the end of the webinar, you will understand what regulatory changes are in store and ways to prepare for them. You'll also learn how to make your voice heard to minimize the impact to your operation. And now I will turn things over to Warren to get us started. Warren?
Thank you, Sue. It's great to be here with Annette Sandberg. It's quite an honor working again with her. If on your screen now, you came to talk about regulations, but you see legislation. We're coming up to the infrastructure bill, and this is where the Biden administration will reveal its transportation policy. And those policy items will be carried out by the regulatory agencies at DOT, FMCSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Federal Aviation Administration, and so on. In fact, most regulations actually originate from legislation when Congress tells these regulatory agencies, do this. And one of the reasons for that is the whole powers of the agencies were built on legislation. FMCSA's powers were in the Motor Carrier Act of 1999. And for those who ever want to look at that again, you'll see that that legislation included mention of brokers and freight forwarders, but for some reason did not include shippers and receivers, which of course are intimately involved in FMCSA regulations. So for example, in the past couple years, we had an FMCSA regulation that prohibited shippers and receivers from coercing truck drivers to violate their hours of service regulations. The only way that FMCSA could do that was when Congress told them to do it. So when we walk through these issues today, you'll see Congress is going to tell FMCSA or NHTSA, here's what we want you to do, and those agencies will have to follow through. So the infrastructure bill, given that it deals with transportation, is likely for a lot of our regulations. And I know that we'll be talking about what can and can't come out of Congress, but then what the agencies must follow through. Now, Annette, I know you and I have experienced that when Congress acts, they really don't give us agency regulators a whole lot of time to get our job done. And it's often difficult because of that. But one of the things that's going to come up, we believe, in the next in this legislation and in the next FMCSA action is driver detention. You have some comments on that?
Yes. So as everyone knows, driver detention has been quite an issue for some time. And I think as we begin to watch the market and as driver recruitment and driver shortage becomes a bigger and bigger issue, I believe that this detention issue is really going to pop up towards the top and likely be seen as some type of provision in the infrastructure bill. So as Warren mentioned, these bills, I always call it Christmas tree in a bill, where they suddenly hang all these ornaments on the bill. And we know that there have been driver detention issues raised in the past, but an infrastructure bill is a perfect opportunity for driver groups to really begin to push this issue. So what happens is, you know, the drivers really are pressed for time. They schedule appointments. The shipper or the receiver does not honor those appointments. And the more that that happens, the more likely it is that drivers and driver groups will be able to take data to Congress and say, we need this issue addressed. The second thing, which is on the slide here, electronic logging devices have really provided visibility that we've never had before in the supply chain. So since everybody is now required to be on ELDs except for short-haul drivers, there is much greater visibility on how much time a driver is sitting waiting to either be loaded or unloaded at a shipper or receiver, and it really provides both the carrier and the driver a much better source of data to show what's exactly happening. One of the things I always talk to, if I'm working with shippers or brokers or others, is that they really have a responsibility to look at what's happening at their facilities and try to reduce detention as much as possible, and understand that as the driver shortage increases, those shippers and brokers and others that behave poorly, so they're constantly detaining drivers and making drivers lose time, are those entities that are less likely to see carriers and drivers willing to take their loads. But I think that this driver detention issue, Warren, is going to become a very big one in this next highway bill.
Thank you, Annette. One of the places we're also looking at as a likely source of FMCSA regulations is on minimum insurance. And again, this is not a place where FMCSA has its own direct authority. Congress has to give it to it. Right now, as we all know, the minimum insurance that motor carriers must carry for non-hazardous cargo is $750,000. Well, the question is that enough in today's tort climate? We're already seeing nuclear verdicts, as they're called, against trucking companies for awards far, far in excess of $750,000. And people are already talking in Congress about $2 million instead being a likely, or maybe even more likely level for required insurance. One of the questions, though, is what is the average claim? Well, the average claim is far, far below even $750,000. But the problem is when you take out insurance, when you take out homeowners insurance, you usually take it out for full replacement cost of the house, as if everything happens to the house, it burns down, and not just because you broke a leg on a chair. And similarly, Congress will say, we need to ensure, no pun intended, that victims in car crashes and truck crashes have compensation at the full level of the claims that they experience. One of the things we looked at after the last election was if the Senate remained in the hands of the Republicans, there would also likely be a great effort to include in this minimum insurance debate efforts at tort reform. Say, yes, it's time to increase minimum insurance, but also here are protections to guard businesses like trucking companies. With an evenly split Senate, that debate will come up, but it's going to be a very, very difficult one to put tort reform protections in place. Looking ahead, we also see that there's probably going to be some equipment changes. And Annette, I believe you're going to talk about Underride Guards.
Yes, thank you, Warren. So one of the issues that's been lingering for some time has to do with Underride Guards. And let's start with rear Underride Guards first, and then we'll talk about side. As many of you know, if you've been watching the Federal Register, FMCSA published a proposed regulatory change at the beginning of this year. In fact, the docket just closed on March 1, and that's to add rear Underride Guards to Appendix G to those items that must be inspected in the annual inspection of the truck. There weren't a lot of comments to the docket. In fact, I looked at the docket this morning. But those that did comment, everybody was very supportive of requiring that trucking companies have these Underride Guards inspected every year. And as many of you know, particularly truck inspectors would know, there are trucks out there that the Underride Guard, you basically could push your foot on it and it will come off, whether they've come loose over time or whatever. A lot of trucking companies do try to inspect these, but I think it's going to become a very critical issue. And actually, by FMCSA taking that action to require these to be inspected every year, then harmonizes the U.S. regulation with Mexico and Canada, which already have that requirement. So I think we'll definitely see FMCSA take that step. But the second step really has to do with side Underride Guards. So if you look at, there was a study that was done in the early 2000s by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and they're the agency inside DOT that sets all the motor vehicle safety standards. And they actually looked at both side and rear Underride and how many accidents or fatalities or serious injuries that would avert. And it's actually quite a few, just because of the size differential of trucks and cars. If you look at strengthening, one, the rear Underride Guard and then putting side Underride Guards, it really does prevent a lot of fatalities and serious injuries, particularly because then the car won't underride completely underneath the side of the truck. I think that there's been more and more pressure from various groups to have NHTSA and FMCSA consider implementing a requirement for trailer manufacturers for side Underride Guards. And in fact, if you look out on the freeway, you know, today, any interstate, you'll see more and more trucking companies are ordering their trailers with side Underride for a lot of reasons. One, it prevents the underride, but they also put the tails on it, which streamlines the air and improves fuel efficiency as well. But I really believe that we're likely to see FMCSA finish the rear Underride Guard and require that be inspected, and then we'll probably likely see NHTSA take action on the side Underride Guards and begin moving that through the rulemaking process in this next administration.
This is Warren, Annette, and I may disagree with you a little bit on the side Underride Guards. The aerodynamic devices that we see on trailers today are very lightweight, but if you have heavy side Underride Guards that can prevent a passenger car intrusion, you're adding to the weight of the truck trailer, which will reduce efficiency and also reduce load capacity. Thereby, you know, at the top end where trucks may be fully loaded, you're going to require more trucks on the road and again go to more fuel consumption and more emissions. And those things conflict with the espoused policy of the Biden administration.
Oh, I don't disagree there, Warren. However, you know, if you look at a lot of the things that are being shipped today and the size of the trailers, a lot of shippers will tell you that the trailers cube out before they weigh out. And so I think, you know, it'll be a matter of seeing how that balances out and what the overall safety is versus the economy of the issue.
Well, I know, speaking of safety, Annette, I know you're going to take the next item as well. Let's go to, there we are, speed limiters.
My favorite subject. Just kidding. obviously. Anybody in the industry knows that speed limiters has kind of been on the agenda for a number of years. And in fact, it was actually considered by the American Trucking Associations a number of years ago whether they should support it or not. If you look at a majority of the very large trucking companies in this country, they already have speed limiters on their trucks and have those set. It's a lot of smaller trucking companies that don't necessarily want to see those speed limiters. There's really been kind of a mixed feeling about whether they make sense or not. I think that if you look at a lot of the issues that have been pushed by various advocacy groups, they say that there should be limiters on every truck in this country and they should be mandated across the board. Now, whether that makes sense or not, I think from an intuitive standpoint, if you're an average citizen out there thinking, oh, wouldn't you want to put a limit on how fast these big trucks can go, the average citizen would say, yeah, absolutely, you have to do that. So I just think, Warren, that if we look at this issue from just kind of the public standpoint, I think a majority of the public would expect that you would see speed limiters on trucks. I think that there's going to be a push in the Congress to actually mandate speed limiters, and it won't really matter what the industry wants. They're going to just say, we think we need to do this. Now, one of the considerations, which I've always raised when it comes to speed limiters, is as you see speeds on interstates go higher and higher. So there are some interstates in this country that have what I consider pretty high speeds. If you limit a truck at 62 or 65, and let's say that the differential between what the speed limit on the interstate is and what that truck is going is 15 to 20 miles, oftentimes that differential speed can create a hazard to the motoring public because they're not going to realize how slow that truck is really going. So I think that those are some issues that need to be raised by the industry. I think trucking companies that already have speed limiters need to show what the data, what their experience has been and whether that's safe or not. But I do think that this issue is going to be raised and at least debated and may show up in the bill.
Annette, do you see this as requiring a retrofit on existing trucks?
Typically, of course, a retrofit isn't that hard because a lot of existing trucks, other than very, very old trucks, have the ability to turn the speed limiter on. I think that it's less likely that they would require that you go back and add some component to put that speed limiter on, and it certainly will be required on all trucks forward. The big issue for both NHTSA and FMCSA is how to look at the devices that are on trucks, and one, to make sure it's on, and two, to determine whether it's been tampered with. And so that'll all have to be in any regulation if there is, in fact, a mandate.
I wonder if we're headed the direction we see in Europe. I'm thinking the German Autobahn, where commercial trucks are limited to certain lanes as well.
I think that would definitely be an issue that needs to be considered, particularly with the differential speeds. If you have trucks limited at 62 and the rest of the traffic at 75, you would definitely want to keep the trucks over in the right-hand lanes with an expectation that the public knows slower vehicles are always over in the right.
Thank you, Annette. We're going to move off of the equipment here and go to the CSA and IRT. The CSA, of course, as you all know, is FMCSA's program, Compliance, Safety, Accountability, to evaluate the safety performance of motor carriers and drivers. Well, for many years, the trucking industry itself has complained that CSA is perhaps too subjective, and that the items that CSA does look at are not all related to preventing crashes. So in legislation a couple sessions ago, the trucking industry and others prevailed, and Congress said to FMCSA, go and take a look at CSA and at possibly revising it. And when you do so, look at this study that we're also ordering from the National Academy of Sciences. Well, the National Academy of Sciences came out with something they call the Item Response Theory, IRT. It's something that is used in science and is used in other disciplines, and it can produce more quote-unquote scientific results and less subjective results in evaluation. The problem is it's very, very data intensive. And FMCSA has not had the response from the industry that they're willing to share much of the data, driver pay, exactly what commodities are carried and where. So looking at this coming time in this Congress, will we see that Congress itself will mandate this data required by IRT? That's one thing that Congress may debate. It's going to be in the fine print in the bill, and it's something to look for. Annette, any comments?
Yeah, I think, you know, one, this is really getting into the weeds, and there may be some congressional interest in this area, Warren. But given all the other safety items that potentially Congress could go after that would probably reap bigger benefits, at least from a public standpoint, I personally don't think this is one. While CSA is important to FMCSA and their state partners to try to identify potentially risky carriers, I think FMCSA and the states are doing a pretty good job of using that data right now. Whether they can refine it some more may be something that they can look at, but I don't think companies are going to willingly go, hey, we want to have all this proprietary data available in the system, and will it really make a difference in the long run? There's probably other additional enforcement activities that the agency could do that would feed additional data into the system, like more mandatory inspections. You know, now that they're doing more compliance reviews remotely, I think you can see the FMCSA and the states do more of those audits in a remote manner, which actually provides a richer data source than whether, you know, what's a driver pay and those kinds of things. But don't rule it out, because anything can happen when you have a large bill like an infrastructure bill kind of looming.
And for those who spend their off hours reading the Federal Register, when you follow what FMCSA puts in there, watch for something called an information collection request. It's required by any regulatory agency when they want to gather more data. And this may be the ICR, information collection request, may be a way that FMCSA does go after this data, if indeed, as Annette says, Congress directs that. Now, Annette, you said that IRT really doesn't grab the public attention, but I think there's something else about CSA that does, and that's the scores themselves. You want to talk about that?
Certainly. As many of you know, if you've been following this for a long period of time, Congress in the FAST Act, and this isn't back, let's go back 6 years, in 2015, in the FAST Act, recommended that the FMCSA remove the scores from public view. And in that same act, they also directed the agency to go to the National Academy of Sciences to do this study that Warren just spoke about. You can go ahead and advance the slide there, Warren. So basically what happened was when the public scores were taken down, then the agency had to make a decision. Do we leave them down? What do we do? And if you go in and look at the scores right now, the scores are still available. The full CSA scores, the percentile rankings, are available for motor coach companies, but they're not available for trucking companies. And the agency had some justification on why they were doing that. However, when FMCSA finally went to the National Academy of Sciences and had them do the full study, the National Academy of Sciences said, first you need to fix the scoring, the IRT, which is the thing that we just spoke about. But then they went on to say that if you decide that you want to make these scores public, we think you need to do an even further study to better understand the statistical operating characteristics of the percentile scores. So really, if the agency is going to follow the National Academy of Sciences, they would be required to do a follow-on study to make these scores public. And I think that it's a step too far at this point, even though there's a lot of pressure from plaintiffs' attorneys and others to make these scores public again. I think that they like to use those as a hook to get into a company where they think, hey, the score showed that they were inherently unsafe, yet the National Academy of Sciences said maybe that's not what the score really means. So I think that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done before these scores go public, and we'll obviously see the IRT go into place and additional data put into that system before we take that next step.
But there will, as Annette says, be pressure from trial attorneys and other safety advocates to put all the scores out there in public so that the public can make their decisions, even if they're ill-informed decisions.
Agreed.
Well,
so
here are a couple things that we don't expect to happen under this administration, and that's a couple pilot projects. Annette?
Absolutely, Warren. So obviously, anytime you have a change in administration, you go from potentially one type of philosophy to another. And I think that while the Trump administration was really about reducing regulations, obviously they had if you want to introduce a new regulation, you have to get rid of 2 old regulations, that kind of thing. And in the past, the agency was really willing to try to look at additional pilot projects or other things. And I think that these two, the split duty and the under 21 pilots, will definitely slowly, quietly go away. I don't see this administration really pursuing these. One, because there's a lot of opposition, particularly to under 21 drivers, even though there's a need for more drivers. And the split duty, where you can extend your workday almost indefinitely, I think it will go away without really hard data to show that it's safe. And quite frankly, given all the other things that we've already spoken on today, the speed limiters, the Underride Guards, those kind of things, I think the agency and the administration will focus on those big safety items and let these that might have been important to the industry but maybe aren't important to safety groups or people that think that certain things should occur within the industry from a safety standpoint should even happen. So I would believe that we're not going to hear a lot of action around these 2 items and that they will just die a slow and quiet death. That's at least my estimation on this.
And I would agree entirely with Annette on that. And we put on the screen, if you can see it, that there will be no more, quote, safety and health neutral, unquote, justifications. You may recall in the last revision of hours of service regulations that FMCSA had justified those revisions not as advancing safety or as advancing health, but saying they're neutral. We're just doing something in a different way. I don't believe this administration will act in that manner. One of the things we're all looking at is, will there be changes in medical regulations, in drug and alcohol testing, for example, and in qualifying drivers to operate a vehicle? Will we have mandatory sleep apnea testing? Right now, that is a recommendation and is carried forward by many of the doctors and medical review officers that examine drivers, but it is not a mandate, and it does have some cost to carriers and to drivers in their time if indeed there would be testing on each and every driver. On the other hand, as we all know, sleep apnea and fatigue are major safety issues, and I believe that we will see a move toward mandatory sleep apnea testing. A second area where I don't know what the results are going to be is in hair testing for drugs. We have seen the results from the agency that sets all the standards for federal drug testing programs. It's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration that said hair testing can be used
to find lifestyle drug users because hair follicles retain evidence of drugs far longer than does urine or than does oral fluids. However, that agency also said there are problems in the sense that certain types of hair retain the evidence longer. Dark hair, which is natural to certain minority groups in particular, retain evidence of drugs longer than does, let's say, blonde or red hair. So they were concerned about what they called effective discrimination. So this is something the Biden administration will have to struggle with, is do we go forward with allowing hair testing for drugs, or do we follow what the agency has recommended, that there be a follow-up test, again, using urinalysis, which effectively eliminates the advantages of hair testing. And the final thing on medical regulations, we have seen a rapid increase in both medical and recreational marijuana. And in fact, when you look at the last results from the FMCSA Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse on positive test results from truck drivers, 82% of the positive results came from drugs. And by far the dominant result came from evidence of use of marijuana. The increase in that will likely also increase those positive tests and will affect then the ability of truck drivers to resume their role in driving trucks and lead into, as we have seen, concerns about a further truck driver shortage.
Yeah, Warren, I can add a couple of things there. Obviously, I live out here in a state that legalized marijuana some time ago, and I know that any time a state goes from medical to recreational legalization, I know that there's a move afoot for national legalization of marijuana. Companies always struggle with really educating drivers around the issues that, though it's legal, it's still not legal if you're a truck driver. And obviously we have to watch any national legislation that happens, but even the early bills that have been floating around would indicate that they still would make it illegal for truck drivers or those that are in safety-sensitive positions from using the drug. The difficulty, and actually ATRI did a study on this a year ago, has to do with the testing that's available out there at Roadside for marijuana. Having come from a law enforcement background, I can tell you it's very difficult to test at Roadside for marijuana and even other drugs. They have a thing called the Drug Recognition Expert program that NHTSA helps fund the states, but it is still very time intensive, and it's not like a breath test that you can give for alcohol. So I think the biggest thing for the trucking industry is to really make sure that drivers know, even if it's legalized, that it's not legal for them. And then there's a second piece that I've seen in my regulatory practice working with trucking companies, and that has to do with CBD, CBD oil, CBD gummies, CBD candy, whatever it might be. Drivers have to be really careful when they purchase this stuff. It's over the counter. Most of it's not regulated. And some of it actually does contain THC, which means the driver may think that they're taking something for back or neck pain or something like that. They think that it's okay, but then it has THC, and then when they get pulled for a random drug test, suddenly they test positive for marijuana. So I really encourage trucking companies to educate their drivers about CBD, about the medical legalization of recreational marijuana, those kinds of things. Keep them educated in what's going on so that they don't get in trouble and lose their job and end up going into the National Clearinghouse as a positive test.
That's good points, Annette. And I'd ask you, from your law enforcement background, the same agency, SAMHSA, that came out with the hair testing proposal that required a second follow-up test, However, they did say that oral fluids testing is proper and can be used directly. But we have not seen FMCSA yet adopt oral fluids testing, which might be useful at roadside.
It may be. I haven't looked at a lot of the oral fluids testing. I think that we'd have to examine the efficacy of that and whether that makes sense roadside. Clearly, law enforcement continues to look for other avenues to test, specifically for marijuana. The states that have legalized recreational marijuana, I know like out here in Washington, there was a long-term study that was done that actually showed impairment from drivers suddenly became greater from marijuana than it was even from alcohol. And so state law enforcement continues to struggle as these drugs get legalized in educating kind of the driver population, hey, it may be okay to use that recreationally, but it's not okay to then jump behind the wheel of a vehicle and operate it, because that increases, you're impaired, and it's going to reduce your response time. So I think that there's a lot of work that has to be done, not just with the trucking industry, but with the motoring public as a whole.
Thank you very much, Annette. And Sue, I believe we've gone through our questions here on the slides, but we're ready to take questions from the audience.
That is great. Thank you so much, Warren and Annette, for your insights on all of those issues. And again, if you'd like to submit a question today, please go to the ellipse icon at the bottom right of your screen, and that should allow you to type a question for us. And now let's get to a couple of the questions that have already come in. First question, we are urged to submit comments on new regulations. Do our comments even make a difference?
I can speak to that, and then I'll be happy to pass it over to Warren. They do make a difference, but let me add a caveat to that. So when I was administrator, and even since then, when I have trucking companies that want to comment on a regulation, it's not enough just to say, I hate this regulation or I really like this regulation. You have to supply data and information that helps the agency make their decision. Typically, when the agency gets a lot of comments in, they'll look at how substantive they are, and if it's a substantive comment where there's data attached to it, the agency has to consider that in making its overall decision. But if it's just, I hate it or I like it, that's not enough for them to hang their hat on to justify the regulation. So what I've always told all my trucking clients, or even shippers or brokers that might want to be commenting on a regulation, it's great that you comment, but make sure that you supply data as to why you're taking the position you're taking. It makes it much more, it's a stronger position, and it forces the agency to really look at the impacts it may have to your business.
And Annette's entirely right on the need for data. One of the things, if you actually have the opportunity to go through the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, the NPRM, that is required for every potential regulation, you will see in there will be a section where the agency, FMCSA or NHTSA, will ask some specific questions that they want answered. And if you have information, data, or even real personal experience that answers those questions, please provide it. They've asked for it. And it also tells the agency that you've read the notice, and they'll pay a lot more attention to you.
Great. Thank you so much to you both. Here's another question. How will side guards be reconciled with state-specific aerodynamic equipment requirements, such as in California?
So typically when the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, if they're going to undertake any kind of change to the FMVSS, they'll look at existing regulations that are out there, and obviously they need to try to conform those regulations, in this instance, to any EPA or potentially California CARB regulations, those things. While they don't have to defer to those, they will want to try to harmonize, because they don't want to just undo anything that's already been done out there to improve, fuel economy and those kinds of things. And I know that NHTSA has been looking at these issues for some time, and they'll obviously take those state regulations into consideration as they're going through that process, in addition to the fact a lot of times, if you look at a lot of the NHTSA regulations, states like California comment on those regulations, especially if they believe that anything that the agency is undertaking may conflict with something that they've already done.
And Annette is, again, on point, but I would also add, if you're making comments to a docket and you know of a conflict yourself, point it out. It's not always possible to catch every conflict that may exist.
Great, thank you. Are rear and side underride guards required to be on trailers now?
Rear underride guards have been required since the 50s. Side are not currently required.
And then following up on that, are side guards required in Europe? And is there any data that does or does not support safety improvement?
I don't know
I
about
will say, and I'm not sure about requirements, but I know side underride guards are quite common in Europe. But, you know, ironically, we're talking about passenger vehicles. In Europe, they're frankly protecting bicyclists from coming underneath the trailers as well. So whether they are of the sufficient strength that are being contemplated here in the U.S., I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. Here's one. Will the September 29th, 2020 hours of service changes be affected by the change in administration?
Well, I'll start off on this.
Go ahead.
Every administration, as we have already seen here with the Biden administration, it's no surprise. They go back and they review what are called, they put on hold what are called the midnight rules that the previous administration has put in place. That being the rules that an administration or letters of opinion that an administration has put out in the waning days of its term in office. Now, as you said, Sue, the hours of service changes were back last September. So that's not the midnight time. And similarly, there have been a lot of reliance on those changes by ELD manufacturers who had to change their software, by motor carriers and drivers who have adjusted to that, by shippers and receivers who have adjusted to the new rules. So there's a lot of investment in that I don't think the Biden administration will willy-nilly say, hey, those don't apply now. What they may, and I think they probably will, go back and take a serious look at it and then come to those issues in the future using rulemaking. Annette?
I would agree, Warren. And the only other thing a caveat I would put out there is there are some lawsuits pending, and it's whether those lawsuits gain any ground. But I don't think the administration in and of themselves they can't just overturn it. They would have to actually do a new rulemaking.
Thank you both. Do you feel the push to produce only electric vehicles will affect the trucking industry?
I think, from my standpoint, potentially so. If you look, there's a major OEM that already announced that in the next 10 years they plan on only producing electric. And I think that there's going to be an ongoing push in this administration, not just with cars, automobiles, but also with trucks.
Agree entirely.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. What impact do you think Secretary Buttigieg will have on FMCSA policy? What types of priorities does he have?
From my standpoint, at least from what I've heard so far, I think that he is really going to continue to push the Biden's infrastructure plan. I think that that's a major initiative for this administration, and I think it's important to the trucking industry that we actually have some kind of infrastructure funding. And so anything that supports that will continue to be a major issue for the Secretary and for the administration. But absent that, I haven't heard specific safety things that he's stated. I think right now he's still getting his hands around all the other issues that are there at the agency, and infrastructure is a major ball to push across the line.
And Annette, having been in the position of reporting directly to a Secretary of Transportation as FMCSA administrator, knows full well that the secretaries have their hands full, multiple agencies, and in this case, an infrastructure bill, big dollar numbers that have to be dealt with first.
Great, thank you. Here's a question. What exactly is the plan for detention? You can be a shipper or receiver for over 10 hours, and some brokers only pay past 5 hours.
Yeah, so I don't think that there's a national plan. I think it's really broker by broker, trucking company by trucking company. But as you see capacity getting tighter, if it gets tighter, it's harder to get drivers. I think what happens is that carriers, particularly really good carriers that are in demand, can start making demands on shippers to say, we're not going to allow our driver to be detained more than X number of hours if you want us to keep servicing your lanes or your freight. And so it really is going to be broker by broker or carrier by carrier that pushes that demand, unless there's a congressional fix. And if Congress gets in the mix and they're pushed by driver groups, there may be a set number that they put in the bill and say anything beyond this point, the driver has to get paid. And so that's what we're saying people need to look for. If driver groups and others begin to push Congress to say, listen, we can't let the market handle this anymore. Drivers are being penalized by these bad, poor performing shippers or receivers or whoever. We need you to set a time. That's when you're likely to see something get dropped into a bill.
And Annette is correct on that, but I would just point out the complications that everyone on the webinar would understand. Many, many shippers and receivers have appointments. They have a schedule that a motor carrier and a driver must meet. And that's, in many ways, that has helped everybody plan their day out. But then when something does go wrong, when the previous trucking company is late, when the shipper has a breakdown of the forklift on the dock, that whole delay cascades down the whole appointment system. And to decide who must pay and how much and to whom gets very complicated.
Thank you very much. Here's another one. Is there any talk of creating a federal CDL license that would allow for standardization in CDL MVR reporting, or standardizing the DOT physical information like the drug screening clearinghouse is in the process of doing for drug screening?
I haven't heard anything like that, and I'll be honest with you, it would be a major, major undertaking, simply because it would mean that the federal government would be taking things away that the states currently control.
I'd agree entirely. It's very complicated. We have seen time and time again when FMCSA and the states agree that something needs to be done, and there needs to be, let's say, just electronic communication between the databases at the 50 states and FMCSA, those things get put on hold because each state has different computer infrastructure. They have different funding mechanisms for that infrastructure. That in itself is a complication.
Thank you. Here's a question. Is there talk about making all drivers have a 2011 or newer truck?
I haven't heard anything on that.
Yeah.
But obviously if we start a push towards fuel economy and electric vehicles, I don't take anything off the table, but understand that anytime you put a regulation like that in place, you have to think about the economic impact that has throughout the industry, and that would have a huge economic impact. And obviously that has to be taken into consideration by Congress, and if they dictate to the agencies that they have to pass a rule, the agencies have to do a cost benefit to any rule that they publish.
And I think the marketplace has been pretty efficient at bringing newer trucks and newer equipment online where they make commercial sense.
Thank you both. We are concerned about 21-year-olds crossing state lines in LCV due to age, maturity, experience, et cetera. Using that logic, do you feel there is also a greater safety issue related to drivers who are, say, 60 years or older, especially if they are new entrants to the industry?
Well, it's always easy to keep a regulation in place. It's harder to put a new one in place that's going to cut somebody out, at least from my standpoint in being in the regulatory area. And in addition to, let's say you wanted to more closely evaluate 60-year-olds or something like that, you have some age discrimination issues you're going to have to deal with there. And obviously there's some concerns. I think probably the one way that gets dealt with has to do with the medical qualifications and can they meet the basic medical standards. But I don't see the agency or anybody going after this older category, quite frankly, because if you look at our driver population right now, we don't have a lot of younger people entering, and our driving population is aging, and that's where we have a lot of very, very good drivers in that category. And until we have data to show otherwise, I don't see anybody going after that group.
Great, thank you. I know you spoke about this a little bit already, but this one's, as a retired police officer of 26 years and a former DRE, it is very time-consuming and difficult for roadside marijuana detection. What challenges do you see for enforcement?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that statement. I, obviously was the chief of the Washington State Patrol. We had a lot of DREs here in Washington. We continue to still have DREs. I know that the amount of time it takes a DRE to do a drug detection at the roadside is extremely time intensive, and it's not really where you want your officers spending a lot of their time, particularly on marijuana. I do know that there are a number of things being developed right now. I don't know how refined they are, whether it's saliva or breath tests or other kinds of roadside tests that can be done for marijuana impairment, and figuring out what THC level would be appropriate, those kinds of things. I think that there needs to be a lot of push, particularly if we go to national legalization, to really put some money in those areas to help enforcement identify impairment at the roadside. It's going to be absolutely critical, or we're going to see fatalities and serious injuries uptick if we don't address that problem.
Great, thank you, Annette. So here, one last question I think that we can, probably a good one to wrap up with. What are your thoughts about electronic weigh station bypass systems and how this makes transportation more efficient?
Well, this is Warren, and I guess I'll field this one first. I had the pleasure of being at the very first meeting of what was called the Crescent Project years ago, over 30 years ago, when state law enforcement and trucking officials were discussing how can we weigh stations more efficient. What do we agree is a common shared value? And they said safety and efficiency. And so electronic bypass systems like PrePass, there's your commercial, do provide that by allowing trucking companies that have reached very good qualifications and good safety records to bypass the weigh stations and allow then law enforcement to focus their attention on those that may need more attention. That adds to the efficiency of the whole system, both law enforcement and trucking. So I think it's been a positive development beginning 30 years ago.
And I would concur. I was here in Washington when we put our first WeighInMotion site in, and that's where the trucks get weighed as they're going at freeway speeds, and then obviously we had the bypass piece as well. But having all the data coming to the scale house before the truck ever gets there and being able to screen out those trucking companies that have good safety scores, have all their credentials in order, their truck is weighed appropriately, and allow them to bypass and instead address, like some questioners had earlier, new entrants that maybe are new to the business and you don't have a lot of data on them, or those companies that have had bad inspections in the past, they don't have their credentials in order or their truck is overweight. That really allows the law enforcement officer who's on a major interstate to focus on those companies that need the focus.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of our program, and I'd like to thank all of you who attended today's webinar. If you have additional questions or would like more information, I'm sure Warren, Annette, and the PrePass team would love to hear from you. You can use the contact information on screen to get in touch. And if we did not get to your questions, I know they will follow up with you directly. And if you know someone who wanted to attend today's program but was unable to do so, or if you'd like to go back and review any or all of today's program, we will have that available on our webinar archive page at www.ttnews.com. Thanks again to our great speakers today, and thanks to all of you for attending. Have a great day.